Okay, so now we are at Unit 4, and in this unit we'll start going over some of the biblical foundations passages that we introduced earlier on in the earlier units. We will also go over the topics of shepherding children, teens, the war of words, the sin of Adam, and effective and redemptive speech. So let's start with some of the biblical foundations passages. So we want to do some reviewing at this point. And we want to review with the idea that every person is made in the image of God. So let me just take this pen and just highlight that for you. The image of God. And who are made in the image of God? We see right here both male and female are both equally made in the image of God. So the language is male and female, He created them. And God blessed them. And the purpose of, one of the purposes that of why He created human beings was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and govern it. Now, this word govern, I said, simply means to be a caretaker, to care for God's creation as human beings who are made in His image. And so we have this a great purpose in why God created human beings. And each human being, because they are made in God's image, has value, dignity, and worth. So every time we mistreat somebody, whether through words or through physical acts, and we went over the violent act of domestic violence, whenever we mistreat somebody, whether verbally or through our actions, we are discarding the fact and disrespecting the fact that the person that we are mistreating is in fact made in God's image. We also talked about singleness, marriage, role of sex in marriage, and divorce and remarriage as well. And 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5 was really a foundational passage. Paul says, "Now, regarding the questions you ask in your letter, yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. But because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband." Again, I said marriage is a relationship in which we can experience release from the sexual pressures that we might feel. But I also said that there is a danger in entering into a relationship if that time in which you are single, you are constantly nurturing some kind of addiction to sexual immorality. That is not preparing you for a healthy marriage. That is preparing you for a very difficult marriage. We pick it up in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 3. The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. And right here, we see the words needs. And this is really emphasizing the fact that we should never wield sex as a weapon against our spouse. To simply physically shut out somebody. So for a woman to physically shut out the man is emotional rejection for men. For wives to be emotionally shut out by the man can feel very, very rejecting. What we see is that the husband should fulfill the wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs, whether the physical comes first and the emotional, or the emotional comes first and then the physical. I guess different genders can generally view it in different ways, but the point is that we are not to deny each other's needs. But Paul says in verse 4, the wife gives authority, and I love that word right here, authority. The wife gives authority over her own body to her husband. And that's really Paul's call to the wife to live a very sacrificial life, even with her own body. And the husband is to do the same. He gives authority over his body to his wife. And this is why I called it a gospel-centered relationship. In a gospel-centered relationship, a gospel love is a type of love where it seeks not to receive or receive only, but it really looks to give. It looks to lay down one's wishes for the good of the other. It looks to lay down one's wants for the good of the other. And in this case, is to lay down your authority even over your own body for the good of the other. And Paul says in verse 5, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy. And then this is a key phrase right here, for a limited time. In other words, prolonged abstinence tends to give the devil a foothold, and he picks that up right here, Satan. Satan will tempt you if you give prolonged, or if you engage in a prolonged abstinence from sexual activity between a husband and a wife. And the only time that we are to refrain from sexual activity between a husband and a wife is to give ourselves to prayer. What is the function of prayer in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5? The function of prayer is to reorient ourselves and to remind ourselves that this marriage between this husband and this wife is not simply about us, but it's really about honoring God through this marriage relationship. And what better way to remind ourselves, to strengthen ourselves, to be filled with God's presence in our life than through a devoted life of prayer. We pick up 1 Corinthians 7 through 11 once again. We said that in the Old Testament, the general view of singleness wasn't always so positive. Yes, there is Jeremiah, where there is a special calling from God to be single, but generally marriage was the norm and singleness was viewed as an aberration. But what we see in 1 Corinthians 7 through 11 is that Paul says something like, in the beginning, he says, I wish everyone were single just as I am. And he begins to emphasize more and more that singleness is a gift from the Lord. It's really a special gift, Paul says. And everybody has different kinds of gifts, and not everyone is called to a life of singleness. However, I did argue in the earlier units that if this is your season of singleness, it really should be devoted to the Lord. Give that gift of singleness to God. And by giving that season of your life to the Lord, we build our character, we build biblical virtues, we build biblical priorities that can have good consequences into our next stage of our life if God should call you into a season of marriage. Paul picks up 1 Corinthians 7 and says, so I say to you, those who aren't married, and to widows, it is better to stay unmarried, just as I am. But if they can't control themselves, if the sexual pressure is too great, even though you are warring against your lust and your sexual urges, if you can't control them, then go ahead and get married. Paul says in verse 9, it's better to marry than to burn with lust. And Paul says in verse 10, but for those who are married, I have a command that comes not from me, but from the Lord. A wife must not leave her husband, but if she does leave him, let her remain single, or else be reconciled to him. And the husband must not leave his wife. The only times that we are allowed to separate from our husband or our wives is in the case of porneia, which we went over in the past unit, as well as abandonment, as Paul talks about in his own letter in 1 Corinthians. Singleness, marriage, role of sex in marriage, and abandonment continued. 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 15, Paul again says, now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. It says, if a Christian man has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to continue to live with him, he must, and here's the word here, not leave her. And if a Christian woman has a husband who is not a believer, and the unbelieving spouse is willing to continue to live with her, she must not leave him. And then Paul picks it up in verse 14. For the Christian wife brings holiness to her marriage, and the Christian husband brings holiness to his marriage. Otherwise, your children would not be holy, but now they are holy. And here Paul is really just talking about the benefits of the believer, even though it may be one believer in an unequally yoked marriage. Paul is talking about the fact that children benefit from the teachings and the life and the wisdom of the believing spouse. In the past units, we talked about how this was not evangelistic marriages where people intentionally marry somebody who is an unbeliever, but this is a case where people are already married, and as the gospel was spreading, one spouse came to faith while the other did not. Verse 15, it says, but if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insists on leaving, Paul says, let them go. In such cases, the Christian husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. So again, Paul is talking about what happens if you are being abandoned by your unbelieving spouse. If your unbelieving spouse is willing to live with you as you try to live out your Christian life, then you are not to leave your unbelieving spouse. But if your unbelieving spouse is determined and insistent on abandoning you, then you are abandoned and therefore allowed to separate in the eyes of God. However, we should nevertheless make the point that we should never drive our unbelieving spouse away. In other words, we can't act in such a way that is so grossly unbearable as to drive them away from the home. That is not what Paul is saying. Paul is talking about the fact that if they are insistent, though you are living your Christian life, then they are free to leave. See, Paul picks up this theme in 1 Corinthians 7, 16 through 17 and 26 to 28. He talks about the fact that we should be good witnesses to our unbelieving spouses. He says in verse 16, don't you wives realize that your husband might be saved because of you? And don't you husbands realize that your wives might be saved because of you? And so what Paul is saying is that God can use, and I'll back it up here, God can use your Christian light in the home to witness to your unbelieving spouse. So again, we shouldn't be acting unbearably to drive them away, but we should rather be drawing them to the Lord by our Christian love. And verse 17, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you, and remain as you were when God first called you. Again, he says, this is my rule for all the churches. And verse 26, because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are. This is going to be a very interesting teaching. If you do not have a wife, do not seek to get married. But if you do get married, it is not a sin. In other words, if your sexual pressure is building, even though that you are in your life of sanctification, in your Christian walk, you are warring against sinful lust. However, if the sexual pressure is building, then it is okay to get married. It is not a sin because it is a clear indication that you do not have the call to singleness. Paul picks it up and says, if a young woman gets married, it is not a sin. However, those who get married at this time will have, here's an interesting word, troubles. They're going to have trouble. So it's a myth to say that just because I have trouble in my marriage that I married the wrong person. Or just because I have trouble or difficulty, I need to exit. Rather, Paul says, be ready for trouble. Marriage brings trouble because you're bonding together in a covenantal oath two sinful people who have two different sets of desires and who are trying to get their own desires to come about in this marriage, and that's going to cause trouble. And Paul is saying, I am trying to spare you those problems. I talked about in the earlier slides on singleness that God gives us wisdom to look for the right kind of character, the right kind of person. We should be careful about the hot-tempered person. We should be careful about the gullible person. We should be careful of the scheming person. We should be careful of the person who constantly complains and whines about how everything's wrong. Because to live with somebody, to be married to somebody who's always dwelling on what's wrong, will rot your bones. One translation of that passage, one English translation said, it's like cancer to the bones. But even if we marry the person that we felt like was of good character, we should still expect trouble. Even though we try to look for somebody who's patient, somebody who loves the Lord, somebody who's meek, somebody who's diligent, still we should expect trouble from marriage, because we are bonding together two sin-broken people who have fallen desires, and they are trying to live out these desires in the context of a relationship. So it is not the time to run away or simply exit the marriage, but it is the time to grow as two people try to grow in their relationship in the Lord. Okay. We see in 1 Corinthians 7:32 to 35, Paul says, I want you to be free from the concerns of this life. An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking about how to please him, but a married man has to think about his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. In the same way, and then Paul goes on to say that women who are no longer married or have never been married can be devoted to the Lord and holy in body and in spirit. But a married woman has to think about her earthly responsibilities and how to please her husband. So in this season of singleness, I know a lot of older singles really find a lot of discontentment in their season of singleness, but it really is a good time to devote yourself to the Lord. Again, in verse 35, Paul says, I am saying this for your benefit, not to place restrictions on you. I want you to do whatever will help you to serve the Lord best. So Paul is calling us to make decisions in our life not based upon our own selfish desires, but in terms of recovering the image of God, where we were meant to live according to God's desires. So Paul is saying in verse 35, I want you to do whatever will help you to serve the Lord best, with as few distractions as possible. We see again 1 Corinthians 7:36 through 40, that if you are acting improperly to your fiancé, and you feel like you will inevitably give into your sexual pressure, then it's better to marry. These are cases where even though you're trying to fight your passion, if you feel like you might give in, Paul says it is better to marry. And marriage is not a sin. But he says if he has decided firmly not to marry, and there is no urgency, and he can control his passion, he does well not to marry. So the person who marries his fiancée does well, and the person who doesn't marry does even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but only if he loves the Lord. Again, I think this is a crucial phrase right here. Only if he loves the Lord. Marrying somebody of poor character, and marrying somebody with poor convictions, marrying somebody who does not have faith in the Lord, and to become unequally yoked will only make your life that much harder. There is no divine authority to appeal to. There is no time where you can say, okay, hold on, let's just step back for a second and see what's going on with you and with me. Let's confess to each other what's going on inside of us, and let's bring it to the Lord. There is no bringing it to the Lord if you are unequally yoked with somebody. And then Paul says, but in my opinion, it would be better for her to stay single, and I think I'm giving you counsel from God's Spirit when I say this. A very interesting passage. Again, we talked about birth control, the acceptable and unacceptable forms of birth control, and we said that to prevent a life from conceiving is generally accepted, though there are special considerations to consider, but to take a life is not permissible. So any form of abortive contraception and any form of abortion is generally not accepted, rather. And we see that in Exodus 21, 22 to 35, that the pregnant woman has a life within her. And Scripture doesn't play the game of when is it life, at what week. It doesn't play that game, but it just says that the life within the woman. And then we talked about divorce and remarriage, Matthew 5:31 to 32. We talked about the fact that the only time that you can divorce is in cases of unfaithfulness, of adultery, or the word porneia. And then Paul talks about being abandoned by your unbelieving spouse. Some people might ask, well, what if my wife or husband claims to be a believer but still wants to leave me? Again, being true in faith is not just about what you say or what you claim, but who you truly are inside is reflected on the outside. And so it is the job of the church to determine the fact that if that person is unrepentant and the person is determined to leave, and then you really are being abandoned at that point, and you are free to separate because that person is acting like an unbeliever. So I hope you enjoyed these biblical foundations, and when we come back, we will talk about shepherding children and teens.